I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with me tonight. And for the music, I'd like to thank Mr. Nelson Riddle.
This is Jonathan Schwartz with Nelson Riddle. It's my understanding that you started as a pianist, but that your father's instrument was the trombone. Is that true?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And you eventually gravitated to the trombone.
I spent more time studying the trombone because, and I might say there was a thin edge of desperation there because for a period of time, I made my living as a trombone player. I never was asked to make my living as a piano player. I long ago would have starved. I had no particular talent for the instrument. I entered the Army on April the 9th, 1945.
When were you discharged?
June 1946.
And then with Bob Crosby to California?
Yes, not too long after that.
In what capacity with the Bob Crosby band?
Just an arranger, as an arranger. No more trombone.
Why did you give up the trombone when you joined the Bob Crosby band?
Because it was after the war, and I had thought that I would not want to travel anymore. I had traveled with the bands for several years. I had a stint in the Merchant Marine, followed by 11 months with Tommy Dorsey. Prior to the Merchant Marine, I had traveled for 2 or 3 years with bands. Then I traveled for 11 months with Tommy Dorsey, and then I had the Army. And when I got out of the Army, I no longer had any great desire to play the trombone anymore. I was more interested by that time in writing things.
Those arrangements, those early arrangements, now granted they were written for a specific band with a specific sound. Did they sound like you? Was there any evidence to suggest Nelson Riddle was at work?
Possible. I did one arrangement for him that he liked very much on Night and Day. That was a good band. I think Gus Bavona was in it.
Any strings? Did they use strings?
No, just a dance band. I knew how to write for strings by that time, having, strangely enough, learned the practical application of it in the Merchant Marine, not too many miles from here, because we fought the incredibly perilous Battle of Sheepshead Bay.
Are you telling me that in the Merchant Marines you learned to write for strings?
That's right. They had a training base at Sheepshead Bay, and they had not only a wonderful military band under the heading of one Phil Lang, whom you must know from his Broadway work.
World,
yeah, and also he worked closely with Morton Gould, I believe. I think Phil Lang and Morton Gould worked together. And the dance orchestra, which was made up of some of the cream of New York musicians, was headed by Dave Terry. His real name was David Terragano, and he was an arranger for Andre Castellanos. He knew a lot about writing for strings. And I worked down there, and just by trial and error, learned a great deal about strings. I do remember 2 arrangers to whom I owe quite a bit. One is Bill Finnegan, who got me started in the business. And some of the sounds that you heard early on might have emanated from him because I really idolized him in those days. I still do, because I think he was really one of the front runners of fine arranging.
What did you think of the Sauter-Finnegan Orchestra?
I thought it was magnificent. They had some sounds there that were incredible. If there was anything to be said, and this isn't negative, it is a comment on top of my original compliment, and that is it was so intellectual that perhaps some of the emotion was not present. Both Sauter and Finnegan were internal people. Neither one of them were outgoing or gregarious at all. They were quiet, studious people, and I think some of their work shows that. It shows in the clockwork precision and intricacy of their work, but it also might occasionally show in the lack of fire and drive.
Interesting, Nelson, because you have a reputation, and it's also clear to me that you are not a bombastic, bravado-making firework of a fellow.
I'm not a swashbuckling pirate like Billy May. Oh, Billy May is so great. He's got so much humor in his work. I also had 2 years of the study of symphonic orchestration with Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, who was an Italian composer, largely remembered for his guitar concerto that he wrote for Segovia and some other beautiful, beautiful pieces. I spent 2 years studying orchestration with him, so by the time I hit Capitol, that was on the GI Bill, incidentally. I studied the orchestration. And so by the time I hit Capitol in 1950, I knew my way around the orchestra fairly well.
What about Too Young?
Too Young was the second arrangement I did for Nat Cole, the first being Mona Lisa. And they were done at the behest of Les Baxter, who was the conductor on both those dates. That was my entree to not only Capitol, but to Nat Cole.
Well, why didn't Les Baxter write the arrangements for Mona Lisa and Too Young?
There was a tradition, Jonathan, which was very prevalent when I came into the business, of the conductor handing out the arrangements. Many of the conductors couldn't write. That wasn't true in the case of Les Baxter, but nevertheless he gave out the arrangements to other arrangers.
Who were the others at that time at Capitol?
Other arrangers?
Yeah. Who could have been theoretically considered for the assignment of Mona Lisa and Too Young?
Oh gosh, there were a half a dozen good arrangers in town, at least, maybe a dozen.
For example?
There was a boy named Albert Harris, Dr. Albert Harris, because he was a doctor. I always call him Dr. Harris, but that's more of a joke than anything else. But Al Harris is a fine musician. He would have been one of them. There were some others. I think Frank Duvall was already a leader. He was in radio, Frank Duvall. Mm-hmm. Paul Villapec would be one. Paul's been dead for a long time. Gus Levine was a man from here who had written for Castellanos and had migrated to California. Mm-hmm. But I was happy that he chose me because it really meant a lot to me, those two arrangements.
And then along came a Capitol singer named Ella Mae Morse, and that was truly the first whiff of Nelson Riddle that we got in her recording of the Blacksmith Blues, because it did what you have done. It made a crescendo with all kinds of instruments going. And it was a big hit. Now, what year could that have been?
That was December 1951. One of my assignments was to write an arrangement of Blacksmith Blues for Ella. She had lost the original arrangement in 1961. So Capitol obligingly gave me a tape from the original master, and I put the arrangement back together. Even the drum key on the glass ashtray, which was the sound that you heard and thought was an anvil, that was Lee Gillette's idea. He was the producer of that date.
On a glass ashtray?
A glass ashtray. I think several were broken.
As a result of that, and that was really an arrangement that helped make a hit record. You know it and I know it. This was basically an unknown singer in a goofy song called the Blacksmith Blues, but it had that urgency in the arrangement. And it would seem to me that arrangement and the success of that record, along with the two Nat Cole records, might have elevated you at Capitol and given you more political legroom. Is that so?
No question. Billy May met me on the street one day, and he said, would you like to do some arrangements for Ella Mae Morse? For whatever reason, I think he might have been too busy. It's called Throwing One a Bone, and he did it very graciously, and I picked it up very voraciously. And that's how the Ella Mae Morse date developed.
Why the muted trumpet and the bass trombone?
Well, I think, Jonathan, they both have an element of humor to me, especially the trumpet played with the plunger has almost a human voice sometimes. And the bass trombone sounds like sort of a bumbling elephant affair, which George Roberts handled so capably. I think the trumpet in this case was Cappy Lewis. But Harry Edison was the man who played most of the muted trumpet solos, but this sounds very much like Cappy.
Obviously, Edison was your choice.
Oh, yeah. And he's got a wonderful sense of humor, both as a musician and as a person.
And all the while that's going on, there are little phrases of music, figures, that identify you. That phrase of music. There are several that run through your work. Have you ever felt in any danger of repetition?
Of course. Some of these phrases, which you seem to view with some affection, always potentially can do you in because you rely on certain tools, especially when you're working rapidly, and 90% of this work was done at breakneck speed.
Why?
Because of the exigencies of time and because of one date crowding on another. Remember, Jonathan, that I was not only a, quote, artist at Capitol, meaning someone who did his own records, but I also was servicing a lot of their other people. That was my choice, but nevertheless it made life quite difficult at times to try to do some sort of justice by my own records and still do what I felt was fair by their great big stable of singers.